Is wrestling the least effective martial art today? I was asked that question and I was pissed. I was stunned that I was asked it. I was insulted. I started thinking about it. And it is very interesting. It is a very fair question. And I'm not sure that the answer isn't yes, wrestling is the least effective martial art today. Now, hear me out. I'm not a traitor to my own craft. But there was a time in this sport, thanks to a man named Dan Severn, where we saw how important getting that top position was, understanding the 10-9 must system, riding out the clock, and beating your opponent. No matter what art your opponent came from, if you could take him down and stay there, you were going to win. Then wrestlers got better at it. Now it's not just going to stay here. I'm going to pound. I'm going to finish fights, right? The Randy Couture's, the Tito Ortiz's that really started to understand ground and pound. The Godfather, Mark Coleman, the Mark Kerrs of the world. Then you had the real advanced guys, Mark Kerr again, who would learn to pass guard. He would learn just enough about jiu-jitsu, the Josh Barnett's of the world, that you weren't going to submit them. In fact, they weren't even going to be in danger, and they were going to pound you out or maybe stretch you. But the sport kept evolving, and I've never thought about it in this context. Is wrestling today the least effective? I'm not saying unimportant. The toughness, the grit, the physicality, the grind, the understanding of the weight cut, in all fairness. The mental of walking out, two people, lights on, scoreboard. Wrestling comes in extremely handy. Wrestling is still amongst the kings. But is wrestling the ability to take a guy from this realm and put him into this realm the least effective sport in martial art? Boy, that's an interesting question that just might be true that I don't want to be true. We are still seeing guys use wrestling. I think we could go back as recently as last weekend. Oliveira, Tony Ferg. Oliveira was able to get on top. Had Oliveira done everything that Oliveira did, just as many strikes, just as much output, but he was on bottom, we're having a totally different conversation about who the winner was. That wrestling is what allowed him to get on top. So we're seeing where that comes in handy, but to act as though Oliveira was out there wrestling would not be true. He used it briefly, and then he went to work in jiu-jitsu. That's where the passing, the mount, the armbar, protecting himself, the defense, all started to come in. The strikes that Oliveira landed, that certainly isn't wrestling. So even though he used wrestling, was wrestling the least effective of what Charles Oliveira did? Arguably, but there's a conversation because he could not have gone to step number 2 without having step 1, which in his case was wrestling. And I don't just mean to use Oliveira's fight with Tony Ferguson as the end-all be-all to this conversation. I think that it's a meaningful conversation. I was going back last night and I was watching some old UFCs. Came across a match with everybody's favorite fighter, Enson Inoue, taking on Royce Alger. Royce Alger is as tenacious of an athlete as you're going to come across. In fact, Dan Gable called him the most intense athlete I've ever coached. 2-time NCAA champion and did many other wonderful things. But Royce Alger was a rough guy. He just didn't ever practice MMA for what it was. He did not spar. He didn't have MMA coaches. He was a rough guy who was in great shape, who loved to compete, that had wrestling knowledge. And Inoue was able to catch his arm in something fairly basic and beat him. But at that time, it wasn't basic. An armbar and extending and rolling over and belly down, it wasn't basic. We'd never even seen it before. I'd never seen it as a viewer. Royce had never seen it as a competitor, but it did bring into attention, okay, Royce has position, and this is back in the 90s. But he lost the match to a basic submission. So even back then, we did understand, look, jiu-jitsu can beat wrestling because it can finish. Wrestling isn't designed to finish a fight. It is designed to control a fight. Totally different conversation, but I'm going all the way back then, even to when wrestling was at its height. When somebody like Royce Alger could get into the UFC just by having such an impressive and beautiful wrestling resume, and many guys like him. I'm using Royce by example because I just watched this match. Fast forward, you watch some of the stuff that Frank Shamrock was able to do. He had limited wrestling with a good understanding of submission. He could take on great wrestlers, but that limited understanding of submission could get him a win. So we've always known this was the case, but are we now to a point where if you look at all of the martial arts, and don't forget, guys like Izzy helped to change this conversation. a guy who has wrestling defense and will touch you up on the feet helps to change the conversation. I mean, that was a bit of a myth 20 years ago. You had your Maurice Smiths come along, you had your Marco Huazes and your Don Fry, but then you start looking a little bit closer, and they all had some level of grappling behind them. Huaz, moreover than Maurice Smith, Don Fry, moreover than Marco Huaz, and that's why they were able to implement and keep guys on their feet. But you do look at the transition of the way things are changing. The fact that the sport was in its infancy in the 90s with some of yesteryear's heroes. Many people are arguing the sport is within its infancy now. I do not agree with that. Hard stop, do not agree. But that doesn't mean those people are wrong, and it doesn't mean I'm right. We're not going to know. It's going to be a hindsight issue. We're going to have to look back in 15 years and see are the guys today doing something that is much more evolved than the guys are doing today. I don't know. I'm just predicting. No. I have not seen the sport grow as rapidly from 2005 to 2020 as I did from 1993 to 2005. I don't want the answer to this to be yes. I want it to be no. I still want wrestling to be king. But I am confronted with some of the nuances and the strategies that take down defenses, which then negates all of your offense, leaves you on a feet in a totally another realm, in conjunction with the submission and positional abilities of others who aren't wrestlers. It's a fair question. It's a fair question. I'm not ready to fully answer it, but I am ready to concede there's a discussion here. The effectiveness of wrestling is not what wrestling used to be. That's true, and that's okay. That's not a knock on wrestling. That's a compliment to the sport of MMA. Is wrestling the most ineffective martial art in MMA today? That is not a question that I ever thought I would have to ponder. But I'm left stuck to produce an answer.